Good luck finding a better offer in this economy, the vice president said, his laugh bouncing off the cold, glass walls of the conference room. His name was Mark. I can still picture the smug satisfaction on his face, the way his colleagues exchanged smirks like I was the punchline to a joke they'd all heard before. My only crime, I knew my worth, and I had the audacity to say no to their insulting offer. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where you felt your voice get smaller? Your value questioned in a room full of people who had already made up their minds about you, that quiet fire that starts in your chest. So if you're watching this right now, maybe in your car, maybe on your lunch break, just tell me one thing. Where are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels, and if something in you recognizes something in this. Stay with me. My name is Amelia Jensen. For 8 years, my work as a data architect has been to map the chaos of global logistics, finding clarity where others see only noise. For the last 3 of those years, I poured my nights and weekends into creating something revolutionary, a proprietary predictive model I named Ariadne. It was more than an algorithm. It was foresight, capable of seeing weeks into a supply chain's future to prevent disruptions before they happened. This was my life's work. My intellectual property, built on countless missed holidays and sleepless nights. It was the reason I was in that top-floor conference room at Logicor Dynamics, expecting a formal offer after weeks of intense technical vetting. I had shown them everything: the elegant architecture, the flawless simulation results, the staggering financial impact. The data was absolute, a clean and perfect mathematical proof of value in response. Mark, the vice president of operations, slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table. The number printed on it was not just inadequate, it was a fundamental miscalculation of value. It was a salary for a subordinate, not for the architect of a system that would redefine his entire division. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the recycled air feeling heavy and still. Mark, I said, my voice perfectly even, I appreciate the offer, but this figure doesn't acknowledge the asset I am bringing to your company, nor the specialized expertise required to command it. And that was the moment he leaned back in his expensive leather chair and let out that full, unrestrained laugh. It was a sound of dismissal, a carefully deployed tool of condescension meant to put me in my place. I felt the familiar heat rise in my neck, but my hands remained steady in my lap. I met his gaze, stood, and smoothed the front of my dress in a single fluid motion. Thank you for your time. The walk out of that room was the longest of my life, the heavy glass door clicking shut on their shared amusement, a sound that echoed with finality. The drive home through the Austin traffic was a blur, the city's vibrant sounds muted by the echo of that laughter. For a terrifying stretch of the journey, his mockery became the voice of my own deepest fears. Asterisk, was I arrogant? Had I overplayed my hand? Asterisk. The market was tightening, and opportunities like this were rare. The weight of my rent, my student loans, my unwavering ambition suddenly felt immense, threatening to crush me under the realization that I might have just thrown away my only real shot. But as I stood in the silence of my own apartment, watching the city lights begin to ignite the twilight, the doubt receded. It was replaced by a cold, hard certainty that settled deep in my bones. I was not arrogant. I was accurate. The simulations didn't lie. The years of sacrifice I had poured into my creation did not lie. They had looked at a revolution and seen only a line item on a budget. They hadn't just underestimated my price. They had fundamentally, catastrophically misunderstood my value. And that was a mistake they were going to pay for. I did not wait for them to realize it. The next 3 days were a disciplined blur of activity. I refined my portfolio until it gleamed, activated my professional network with carefully worded messages, and scheduled 2 interviews with promising tech firms. There was no time for unproductive emotions like anger or resentment. There was only the calm, forward motion of a professional securing her next opportunity, treating Logicor as nothing more than a flawed data point. I was in the middle of drafting a follow-up message to a recruiter when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I would let such calls go to voicemail, but some instinct made me pause. I watched the screen for a moment before answering, my voice neutral. "This is Amelia." There was a brief pause, filled with the faint, sterile sound of a corporate office. Then, a deep and measured voice carrying an undeniable undercurrent of urgency. Miss Jensen, this is Arthur Sterling, the Chief Executive Officer of Logicor Dynamics. My posture straightened instantly. My hand stilling on my mouse, I had never spoken to him, never even seen him. I remained silent, letting the weight of his title hang in the air, forcing him to be the one to bridge the gap. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. I'm calling because we have a situation, he began, the carefully controlled stress evident in his tone. Our largest client, AeroCorp, is threatening to pull their $200 million contract, effective immediately. I listened, my expression unchanged, my breathing steady. Their entire global supply chain is in chaos because our predictive models failed catastrophically over the last 48 hours. A fleet of cargo ships is heading to the wrong continent. We're flying blind, Miss Jensen. He took a breath, his professional composure cracking for just an instant. My engineers have been working around the clock. They are certain. The system you built is the only thing that can fix this. I held the phone to my ear, the cool glass against my skin, and said nothing. The silence stretching from my Austin apartment to his top-floor office was no longer an awkward pause. It was a strategic asset. It was the sound of a power dynamic shifting in real time, a tectonic recalibration of value. In that quiet, I was not the rejected candidate. I was the sole proprietor of the only solution to a $200 million catastrophe. I let the silence do its work, letting him sit with the full weight of the admission he had just made. His entire organization, with its layers of confident vice presidents, had failed, and they needed me. Miss Jensen, oh, are you there? His voice was tighter now, the veneer of executive calm beginning to fray. I'm here, Mr. Sterling, I finally replied, my tone as placid as a still lake. I'm simply processing what you've told me. You're in a difficult position, one that seems to have been entirely preventable. I let that statement land, a soft but precise countermove. It was important that he understood this was not a negotiation between equals. This was a rescue operation, and I was setting the terms of engagement. I am aware of the circumstances, he said, his voice clipped. What would it take to bring you on board? Name your price. The invitation was blunt and desperate, but I knew this moment was about more than just money. My price, Mr. Sterling, is not a single number. It is a set of conditions, 4 of them to be exact, and they are all non-negotiable. I could hear the faint squeak of his leather chair as he shifted under the pressure. I'm listening. First, I began, my voice steady and clear, we will address compensation. The initial offer was an error in judgment, my market rate, considering my specialized expertise and the immediate crisis, is 30% higher than the figure your team proposed. Furthermore, there will be a one-time signing bonus, a corrective measure for the initial undervaluation, equivalent to 100% of the first year's base salary. The silence on his end was heavy with calculation. I gave him a moment before continuing, my voice unwavering. Second, I will require full, unimpeded authority over the data architecture and its related projects. My title will be Director of Data Strategy, and I will report directly to you. There will be no intermediary management. The failure you are currently experiencing is a direct result of operational interference and a lack of technical understanding at the leadership level. To fix the problem, I must be insulated from the conditions that created it. I let him absorb the direct challenge. Before he could respond, I moved on. Third authority is useless without the right instruments. I will have the sole discretion to build my own team. This includes the budget for hiring the necessary talent from outside the company, and, just as importantly, the authority to reassign any current personnel who do not align with the project's new direction. I need a team of specialists, not politicians. I paused, letting the 3 audacious conditions settle. I knew the 4th and final condition would cost him the most, not in dollars, but in culture. It was the most important one of all. And finally, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice dropping slightly, becoming even more deliberate. The last condition is systemic. Logicor will implement a new protocol. I have designed a system of absolute performance transparency. Think of it as a black box for intellectual contributions. Every significant line of code, every architectural innovation will be logged, attributed to its creator, and its impact tracked automatically. This isn't about praise or blame, it's a risk mitigation protocol. It ensures that competence is rewarded, and that a catastrophe caused by unchecked incompetence and intellectual dishonesty can never, ever happen again. The line was completely silent for a full 10 seconds. This last condition was a cultural bomb. It would dismantle the old ways of doing things, where managers could take credit for the work of their subordinates, where mediocrity could hide behind a title. It was a direct assault on the very system that allowed someone like Mark to thrive. Finally, he spoke, his voice devoid of its earlier stress, replaced by the cool decisiveness of a man who had made his calculation. "The cost of not doing this is far greater than the cost of implementing it," he said, more to himself than to me. "The terms are unconventional, Miss Jensen, but the situation is exceptional." He took a breath. "You have a deal, all 4 conditions. Have your lawyer contact our legal department. We need you to start on Monday." Monday morning arrived not with a sense of triumph, but with the cold, quiet focus of a strategist on the first day of a campaign. I walked through the gleaming lobby of Logicor Dynamics, the same path I had taken as a candidate. The air was different now. I was escorted directly to my office, a spacious room with a panoramic view of the Austin skyline, the same view as the conference room where I had been dismissed. My contract, with all 4 of my audacious conditions now legally binding, was a tangible presence in my briefcase. It was the new constitution for a small, but powerful, part of this company. I spent the first hour alone, performing a deep diagnostic on their system. The data streams were a chaotic mess of error logs and panicked overrides. It was a digital crime scene, and the evidence of incompetence was everywhere. Just before 10 o'clock, an alert appeared on my screen: a mandatory project meeting in conference room A, the war room. It was time. As I entered, the half-dozen engineers and analysts already seated fell silent. Their gazes were a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. At the head of the table stood Mark. He was dressed impeccably, his smile perfectly calibrated to convey professional courtesy, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "Amelia," he said, extending a hand, "welcome to the team. We're all eager to get your perspective on the recent challenges." The handshake was firm, brief, and utterly insincere. He then gestured to another man. "And this is David Chen, our head of information technology." David was the opposite of Mark, quiet, watchful, with an air of immense technical confidence. He gave me a short, almost imperceptible nod. I filed the interaction away. Mark began the meeting with a presentation filled with corporate jargon, unforeseen market volatility, legacy system constraints, a masterclass in obfuscation, a narrative designed to frame a catastrophic failure as an unavoidable act of nature. The engineers in the room shifted uncomfortably when he was done. He turned to me, that plastic smile fixed in place. "So, Amelia, your initial thoughts?" I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I said, "David, could you please grant me presenter access on the main display?" The screen went blank for a moment before my own interface appeared. I didn't show slides. I brought up the raw system logs from the 48-hour period of the collapse. Line after line of code and error messages filled the giant screen, a silent, damning testament. "The problem was not market volatility," I stated. My voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension. I used my cursor to highlight a specific repeating sequence of failed queries. "The problem was a fundamental flaw in the primary sorting algorithm. It created a recursive loop that, under high-stress conditions, didn't just fail, it began feeding corrupted data back into the network. This wasn't an external shock, it was a systemic failure waiting to happen." The room was utterly silent. The engineers leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the screen, recognition dawning in their eyes, and in that moment, I saw it. It was a micro-expression, a signal so faint almost anyone would have missed it. Mark, for a fraction of a second, broke eye contact with the screen and glanced at David with sharp, controlled anger in response. David's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and he gave a nearly imperceptible nod back. It was not a gesture of agreement, it was an acknowledgement, a confirmation that their shared narrative had just been publicly dismantled. And in that moment, I understood the true layout of the battlefield. My enemy was not just one man. It was a deeply entrenched partnership that controlled the flow of information. The problem at Logicor was not just a flawed algorithm, it was a political infection, and I had just exposed the first symptom. The quiet acknowledgement was not a declaration of war, it was the activation of a silent, embedded immune system designed to neutralize a foreign element like me. The very next morning, I felt its first, subtle pressure. I arrived early, ready to begin the initial data migration for Ariadne. When I attempted to access the primary logistics server, my screen flashed "Access denied." I placed a call to David's office. He answered with practiced regret in his tone. "Ah, Amelia, we rolled out a new network-wide security protocol last night, a pre-scheduled update. You'll need to fill out the SR-47 form and get it signed by operations." A perfect, elegant trap. The form required a signature from Mark. Complaining to the CEO about a security protocol on my second day would be a disastrous show of weakness. "Understood, David," I said. After the call, I opened a new encrypted document on my drive, a file I labeled Chronology. I logged the date, the time, the incident, and David's professionally hollow explanation. They had chosen plausible deniability as their weapon. Mine would be data. 2 days later, the second attack. My project required a set of high-performance servers. The hardware had been approved, but when I checked its status, the order had been flagged and put on hold pending a budgetary review by operations. Another checkmate. I took a screenshot, added it to my chronology, and wrote a brief, objective summary. The third move was Mark's. He scheduled a critical path meeting with the engineering leads. I was not invited. I only found out when a junior engineer hesitantly asked me about a new, impossible deadline that had been set in the meeting. I checked my calendar. At the exact time of their meeting, Mark had scheduled a conflicting mandatory onboarding session for me with human resources, a perfectly executed maneuver to exclude me. That evening, I finally understood their strategy. They weren't trying to fire me. They were trying to make me fail. They would starve my project of resources, access, and information. They would tie me up in red tape, isolate me, and then, when the deadlines were missed, Mark would present a detailed, documented case of my incompetence to Sterling. It was a slow, methodical assassination by bureaucracy. Their single, critical miscalculation was this: they forgot a company is a human ecosystem, filled with histories, resentments, and loyalties that never appear on an organizational chart. I spent the next 2 days not analyzing supply chains, but careers. I sifted through project archives and performance reviews, searching for a specific pattern: a brilliant engineer whose innovative work had suddenly gone quiet a few years ago, coinciding with Mark's rise to vice president. The pattern led me to one name: Ben Carter, a senior programmer, one of the company's first technical hires, now just 3 months from retirement. His early work was legendary, but for the past 4 years, his contributions were relegated to minor maintenance tasks. I knew I had to approach him carefully. I found him in the company's near-abandoned library. I didn't mention Mark or the sabotage. I simply introduced myself and laid out a complex technical problem related to accessing historical data streams without triggering modern monitoring protocols, framing it as a theoretical puzzle. He listened intently, and then a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "He's got you locked out, doesn't he?" Ben said, his voice a low rumble. "David, always good at building walls, never much good at building bridges." He confessed that years ago. He had built a comprehensive diagnostic system, a project he called Cassandra, that would have predicted the AeroCorp failure, but Mark had shut it down, calling it an unnecessary expense. For Ben, my problem was a chance at vindication. He stood and beckoned for me to follow him, deep into the building's infrastructure, to a cold, humming server room I had never seen on any schematic. In a dusty corner was a rack of older, unlabeled servers. "The old hub," Ben explained. "The company's original data core, when David built his new network. He migrated everything, but he didn't decommission this. He just cut it off from the main interface." He pointed to a small, hidden maintenance port. "But it's not disconnected from the data. It still receives a mirrored feed of everything on the network, a deep-level backup. It's a ghost system. It sees everything, but no one knows to look at it." He handed me a small access drive. This will give you a secure, untraceable connection. You'll have access to every piece of data on the network. In real time, they can build all the walls they want. From here, you'll be able to walk right through them. I took the drive. The cage they had so carefully constructed now had a secret door. From the silent sanctuary of the old server hub, I could see everything. I watched the flow of panicked internal messages, the carefully curated reports Mark was sending to the executive team, and David's periodic security sweeps of a fortress I had already breached. Exposing their sabotage directly would be a messy political battle. I couldn't just expose their past actions. I had to create a new, undeniable event. I had to build a trap and bait it with their own arrogance. My public performance began. In the hallways, I was the picture of polite frustration. Meanwhile, in the untraceable silence of the ghost system, I was building the bait. I took a version of my Ariadne algorithm and deliberately crippled it. It was a work of artful sabotage. On the surface, it would perform brilliantly in any small-scale test. But I had woven a single, fatal flaw into its core logic, a flaw that would cause it to collapse into chaotic, nonsensical outputs when connected to the massive, live data stream of the entire company. It was a Trojan horse, beautiful on the outside, but filled with self-destructing code. I placed this flawed masterpiece onto a development server that I knew they monitored, in a folder labeled Ariadne_optimized_final_build. It was the digital equivalent of leaving a diamond on a pedestal in a locked room you know is being watched. Then, I waited. For 3 days, nothing. On the 4th afternoon, it happened. My ghost access showed a high-level administrative override, executed by David's credentials. Copying the entire Ariadne_optimized_final_build folder from my development server to Mark's private executive directory. They had taken the bait. The final piece of the trap snapped into place the following morning. An urgent, company-wide calendar invitation appeared from Mark's office for the entire executive board and Arthur Sterling. The subject, a breakthrough solution for the AeroCorp project. I stared at the invitation, not with anger, but with the calm, quiet satisfaction of a watchmaker seeing all the intricate gears of a complex timepiece finally click into perfect alignment. Mark was walking into that room to present his career-making triumph. I was walking in to watch him present his confession. I walked into conference room A 5 minutes after the meeting had started. The air was thick with anticipation. At the head of the long table sat Arthur Sterling, his expression unreadable. Mark was at the podium, basking in the attention. He gave me a magnanimous nod as I took a seat along the wall. He was a masterful performer, speaking with passion about synergizing next-generation solutions. He explained how he and his team had taken my promising but unfinished model and forged it into a market-ready asset. He launched the simulation using the stolen code. On the main screen, elegant graphs appeared, showing a dramatic initial increase in predictive accuracy. The board members murmured in appreciation. Mark smiled, triumphant. Then, as the simulation pulled in more live data, the first flicker of chaos appeared. A predictive curve that should have been smooth began to twitch, then jagged erratically. Within seconds, the elegant curves fractured into a chaotic lightning storm of error-ridden projections. The room fell silent. Mark's confident smile faltered. "Just a minor data caching issue," he said quickly, his voice a little too loud. "The core logic is sound." "Is that so?" Arthur Sterling's voice was low, but it cut through the room. His gaze shifted from the chaotic screen, past Mark, and settled directly on me. "Miss Jensen, your assessment." This was the moment. I stood and walked calmly to the front, connecting my own device. "Mark's presentation is interesting," I began, my voice even and clear, primarily because the algorithm he just demonstrated is, in fact, mine, and he has presented it incorrectly. A ripple of confusion went through the room. I brought up a split screen. On the left was Mark's failing simulation. On the right, I launched the true version of Ariadne. The same live data flowed into both. While Mark's model continued its chaotic descent, my algorithm's output was a picture of clarity and perfect prediction. The contrast was absolute. The version Mark acquired was a deliberately flawed Trojan horse. I explained calmly, designed to fail under a full data load. Before anyone could speak, I switched to my final display. It was the access log from the Ghost system. And this, I said, using my cursor to highlight a single line, is the record of that acquisition, a high-level administrative override, executed by David Chen's credentials, copying the Ariadne _optimized_final_buildy folder from my server to Mark's private directory 4 days ago at 2:17 in the morning. The silence that followed was absolute, the heavy, profound silence of a conspiracy being laid bare. I watched as the color drained from Mark's face, his expression shifting from arrogant confidence to stunned, horrified realization. He had walked into a trap of his own making, and I had just handed the board the key, the motive, and the signed confession. After a long minute where the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning, Sterling spoke, his voice like a blade. "Mark," he said, "you and I will be having a meeting with our Chief Counsel in Human Resources, immediately. Wait for me in my assistant's office." There was no argument. Mark simply nodded, gathered his things with trembling hands, and walked out of the room, not once looking back. The door clicked shut, and a new era began. Sterling's gaze swept the room, landing on me. The atmosphere shifted from a tribunal to a strategic council. "Well," he said with grim pragmatism, "it appears we have an opening for the position of Vice President of Operations." He looked directly at me. "The job is yours, Miss Jensen. If you want it, your authority will be absolute." This was victory, but I felt only the weight of the next move. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I replied calmly. "But a new title isn't enough. The problem was never just one man. It was a system that allowed his actions to go unchecked, a system without accountability." I held his gaze. "If I accept this role, it will be with the full mandate and budget to implement the performance transparency protocol I outlined in my conditions, not just for my team, but across the entire company. We will build a culture where data, not politics, determines value. That is my price for fixing not just this project, but your company." Arthur Sterling looked at me. A long, appraising stare. I saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. "You didn't just expose a bad manager, Amelia," he said, using my first name for the first time. "You exposed a rot in our foundation." He nodded, a single decisive motion. "You have your mandate, fix the system." 6 months later, I sat in my office, Mark's old office. The view of the Austin skyline was the same, but the company seen through that glass was fundamentally different. The quiet hum that permeated the floor was not one of tension, but of focused productivity. The Ariadne protocol, as the performance transparency system was now officially known, was fully implemented company-wide. It had worked better than I could have imagined. We had not only saved the AeroCorp contract, we had used the system's success to secure a new, even larger one with their biggest competitor. A notification popped up on a side screen. It was from a private industry forum. The post was brief, a footnote in a discussion about market trends. It mentioned that a new consultancy firm, started by 2 former Logicor executives named Mark and David, had quietly dissolved after only 4 months. There was no public scandal, no dramatic article, just the quiet, lethal verdict of the industry itself, the back-channel whispers about untrustworthy operators, the reputational death that comes when a network decides you are no longer relevant. I read the post, and I felt nothing. No surge of victory, no satisfaction in their failure. Their fate was simply the final, logical output of a long equation they had written for themselves. I closed the notification and turned my attention back to the work on my screen, to the complex and beautiful challenge of building something that worked, something that was fair. The laughter that had echoed in that conference room so long ago seemed like a sound from a different lifetime. The real triumph wasn't my victory over them. It was the victory of a better system, one where value could never again be so catastrophically misunderstood.